Bima Falami, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Brearley, did anybody warn you, or rather anybody who works for you in Ofgem, that maybe with British Gas there was a problem?
So
before any public press reports or anything came out.
So we had extensive conversation with consumer groups who were warning us about behaviour across the industry, actually not necessarily targeted on British Gas. And in fact, before I came in front of this committee last time, we spent time with both the companies and with the consumer groups to identify what the issue was, and that led to the compliance review, because that's how we understand and get the evidence around behaviour, but also led to us to look again at the code of practice to make sure the companies are clear on the rules. Now, I'm not pretending that these are simple judgments. Trying to understand the vulnerability of a family who may not want to talk to you is complex, but it's the supplier's responsibility to deliver against that.
So one of the, and I appreciate it's pot calling kettle black when we say we talk about a lot of reviews. Politicians like reviews as much as Ofgem. You have often said, look, you've seen evidence, you've heard things, and then you do a review, and that gets to the heart of the problem. And not just in this area, you can name lots of other areas, I'm sure. Do you think, as a process, that's really adequate? I mean, to what extent, my question for you is, to what extent are you monitoring real-time information and data? So you don't need a review, you can stamp things out where they go wrong.
So look, we do have data monitoring, and again, Neil can expand on that. But what we're looking here to establish the evidence of what's happened is to look at the way in which companies have behaved, the way in which they have treated customers, and indeed the way in which their operatives have treated customers. Now, you can't do that without an extensive process that looks at the behaviours involved. Last week, we launched a partnership with Citizens Advice to make sure that we're not just getting the company's paperwork around this, and it comes back to the questions in the previous session. We are going to hear directly from customers and customer experiences. That does take time.
Right. Just to add to what Jonathan said, yeah, absolutely, we are improving our monitoring functions.
What currently are the monitoring functions?
So we receive a range of reports on a monthly and quarterly basis from suppliers across the market, that's domestic and B2B, and we use that to make our risk assessment of where things are going on. We match that with reports that we get from the consumer and charity groups who meet with them on a monthly basis, and they report issues to us. We get some whistleblowing, and in addition to that, we do some monitoring of social media to really get an understanding of what's going on in the market. We recognise that that's a journey. We've changed our operating model in Ofgem to move to a professions-based model to invest in those resources and the different capabilities such as digital to make those processes easier so we can get to the heart of the model. And the compliance change of approach, the compliance enforcement strategy of going to market compliance reviews is proactive. So we're looking at those and saying, look, across the market now, we're identifying things that we want more information on and we're challenging the suppliers to up their game. And if we continue to do that process, we may need to go in more in depth, appreciating it may need more sample testing, more substantive testing, it may be more invasive, but we get to the end of that process, we hope to improve the standards right the way across the industry.
If that process works well, you won't actually need to be asking the suppliers constantly for these reports. You should just know things, and that should make everybody's life a lot easier. Just, I suppose, one last question. I was very struck, Mr. Brearley, by your comment about effectively most people in this industry aren't making money in the retail market. And obviously there's been a price shock, and we're not unique to that in the United Kingdom. It's happening all over Europe. How do you see us getting to an equilibrium where we have businesses that make a reasonable profit at the same time as fewer people being forced into the terrible situations that we've heard about today over the last couple of hours? Now, I'm not asking about the process of getting there, right, but actually, what does that world look like?
So look, I've said to our board, there are 3 things we need to do with the retail sector. So first of all, as you say, is return it to reasonable profitability. We cannot create companies without sufficient investment behind them. Second is to move them to a more financially resilient place, certainly than they were a year ago, and we have made a great deal of progress doing that. But neither of those 2 things could or should happen without service standards improving. And I go a bit further than simply talking about vulnerable customers. We think service standards need to increase across the board. Let me give you one example of our compliance reviews last year. So E.ON, 50% of calls are dropped before they're answered. Now, if you're a vulnerable customer, how do you tell your company you're vulnerable if you can't get through on the phone? So my view is those three things go together. The deal with the industry is we will continue to amend the price cap, and we have made significant changes to the way it works. We will be monitoring and maintaining financial resilience, but the industry as a whole needs to improve its standards.
And last question, Chair, if I may. Which regulatory changes, if any, are required to get to that world that you have just outlined?
So I think the compliance reviews we have, the way in which we proactively check across the sector, should drive up standards. I am interested, coming back to your previous question, about whether there are some automatic ways you can build in financial incentives for good service standards. But it's my belief that by doing that and by continuing to run these reviews, they're not one-off, they should be over time. And as you say, accompanied with real data, we will be able to move the sector to an equilibrium that I think works for everyone. But to do that, we do need the suppliers to take this seriously. The other thing I would say, though, and you've heard me say this publicly before, behind this problem is a huge problem of affordability right now. Now, the government have put huge amounts of support over the last 6 months. You know, we were talking in August of prices that might be £5,000 or £6,000 right now. But the simple fact is, if you are low income, if you are a high energy user, if you have a child with disability who relies on electricity for their equipment, or you live in a drafty social housing home, your energy bill is extremely difficult to afford. Now, if we don't tackle that together, then it's very hard to create the rules and the system around it that's going to get to that place that you're describing. And that's why we are keen to work with government on a social tariff or something else that will address that problem.
Okay, thank you.